أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, and welcome to the Dictations. Inshallah, today we want to talk about another topic which concerns concerns sincerity and Ikhlas. And sincerity is a subject that you can look at it from many different perspectives when it comes to the religious tradition. Sincerity in worship, sincerity in the way you do certain things, sincerity in your thoughts, sincerity in your actions. And it's obviously one of the most important moral virtue that a mu'min and a believer can have. And that's what we want to look at today, but from a very particular lens. We want to look at a book summary as well today, inshallah. But before we do that, I want to introduce this topic by quoting a very interesting story that is recorded in a tafsir work, a Shi'i tafsir work written in the 6th century Hijri, which is around 12th century, by a very prominent scholar named Abu Futuh al-Razi. Abu Futuh al-Razi was a scholar, and he is buried in the shrine of Shah Abdul Azim in Tehran, or Riya as they call it. And he wrote a tafsir in Persian, in Farsi, and perhaps I think it may be the first ever Shia Farsi tafsir that was ever written in the Persian language. It was called Rawd al-Jinan wa Ruh al-Janan. The whole name was Rawd al-Jinan wa Ruh al-Janan. That was the name of the book, or the tafsir work. And it's a number of volumes. And in this book, he cites a interesting story. And this story is then also cited again by some of his students, and then, it's passed down since then. And that story is about a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam, whose name was Abu Aswad ad-Du'ali. Abu Aswad ad-Du'ali is known to be a very, actually he's known to be perhaps the first Arabic grammarian. And the story as it goes, Imam Ali alayhi salam taught him some rules of grammar, and then Abu Aswad created an entire science out of it, an entire discipline out of it. And this is something that is agreed upon by Shia, Sunni, all the sects, that yes, Abu Aswad al-Du'ali was perhaps the first grammarian or the first individual to set down or create the discipline of Arabic grammar. And he wrote a work on it and so on. So he was a poet, but a companion of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And there's a story where after Imam Ali, has been killed, Muawiyah, who was the arch rival of Imam Ali, he tried to, bribe Abu Aswad as much as he could to win his loyalty and win his support. So he would give him, money, he would give him different gifts, all these type of things. And then one day he gives him a variety of gifts, and in these gifts there's all bunch of different food items and different types of gifts. And there is a type of a sweet dish that he has also given to Abu Aswad. And the daughter of Abu Aswad picks up, one of these sweets, and she eats it. And she basically, Abu Aswad tells her that this is a gift from Muawiyah. So there's two versions of this report. Some of them say that the daughter herself, when she figured out this is a gift from Muawiyah, she threw it out. And the other version says that no, Abu Aswad told her this is a gift from Muawiyah and you should spit it out. And she said, why should we spit it out? Why should I spit it out? It tastes very nice. And Abu Aswad said that this is actually poison. And then he explains to the daughter that, look, Muawiyah is trying to win our loyalty. And he wants us to abandon our loyalty to the al-Bayt, to Imam Ali in particular, and he's trying to bribe us. And at that point he says these lines of poetry over here, which if I can just maybe do it like this. And he says, أبالشهد المزعفر يبن هند نبيع إليك إسلاما ودينا فلا والله ليس يكون هذا ومولانا أمير المؤمنين. So he recites these lines of poetry, and he says, O son of Hind, O Muawiyah, with your honey mixed with saffron. So it was a type of dish which had saffron mixed with honey. Do you think we will sell our Islam and religion to you because of this sweet honey mixed with saffron that you've given us? He says, no, by Allah, we will not do that. How can this be when our master is Amirul Mu'mineen? So how can, do you really think we're going to sell our loyalty and our, love for Imam Ali, and also acknowledging that you are his arch rival and his opponent and his enemy? Do you really think we're going to sell that and give that away for some sweets that you have given to us? Now, what's interesting is that when we look at the, this entire, why am I starting with this story? Because this is a story or a sort of anecdote about someone who is staying loyal to Amirul Mu'mineen at any cost. He's not getting bribed by these small gifts and, even bigger gifts that Muawiyah would send to him. Whereas when you look at the actual life of Ali ibn Abi Talib, we realize that it was a very, he's known for the fact that a lot of his loyal followers, those who had given him allegiance, those who had pledged their allegiances to him, they did actually end up abandoning him. Many of them, dozens and dozens and dozens of companions, are recorded in history over the course of different years, like many years, not everybody on the same day, but over the course of time, many loyalists who were on the side of Imam Ali, they were eventually bought out by Muawiyah through money, through promises that Muawiyah would send to, give them, promises of land and estate and homes and gifts and all sorts of things that Muawiyah would give them. And we have an entire record of loyal people who had given loyalty to Imam Ali, but unfortunately they, because of this love for the dunya, this wealth, they eventually would sell it away, sell that loyalty for a very cheap price. And that became a sort of theme in the Shi'i tradition, Shia hadith corpus. This became a sort of a theme where the Imams, later Imams as well, they keep alluding to this point, to not sell your loyalty and to not sell your love and your deen ultimately for the dunya. Do not sell your akhirah for the dunya. Don't do that. And do not make, and do not sell your akhirah by using our name and our message for your own personal gains. Don't do that either. And this became a very prominent theme in the Shi'i hadith tradition at the very least. And that's what we want to sort of look at today. Now, funny thing is, back in 2007, between 2007 to 2011 and 12, there was a very interesting period that was, at least in the Western Shia community, what was happening. That time, Facebook had come out recently. I think 2005, 2006, Facebook had come out. So social media was, it was relatively new. It's a new phenomenon that we were all dealing with and experiencing at that time. YouTube was out as well at that time. And what happened is there was this entire campaign against scholars and speakers who would charge money for reciting lectures. And there were these two camps in the Western Shia communities. There were these two camps that were formed. There was one camp that was calling the other camp of scholars out and other speakers who would set a specific rate beforehand. They would say, I will come recite a majlis, or I will come recite a noha, for example, latmiya, for these many days, and this is my rate, specific rate, and I'm going to charge this much money. And some of them even made demands for hotels and all of that, first class tickets. So there was this entire camp of people in the Shia communities, at least in the West. I'm talking about it from the Western perspective because that's the one, I lived through myself, and I was part of that. I was experienced that. Calling out these other group of scholars who are actually many of them are very, very well-known speakers around the world. They speak around the world. Many of them are still very popular. And they were calling them out. And it came to the point where this entire title, came to be called, they were called and labeled as scholars for dollars. Scholars who just go and their main intention is just making money. On the other hand, those scholars who were setting rates and charging money before they even go and give a speech, they were coming back with their arguments. They said, look, we are making a contract because we put in so much effort. We spend time in this. We're not doing it for it's not coming. Ilham and wahi is not coming to us. Revelation is not coming to us. We actually have to go spend hours and hours and hours preparing the lectures, making sure that our oratory is up to par. So that's why we're effective and impactful. So all of that, there has to be some return on it. Communities should be able to pay us for that as well. And therefore, I'm signing a contract. And that was sort of their counter argument. And it kind of, this argument, this contention between these two camps, it continued from 2006, 7, all the way till at least, I remember, 2011 and 12, it was still, pretty prevalent in the Western Shi'a community. And around 2012, when I went to Qom, I was, or right before going to Qom, I had heard that there was actually a book written about this very exact topic, about whether you should charge money before reading a majlis or reading a noha, latmiya, or in Farsi they say roze khani. Should you charge money or not? That apparently a scholar had written a book on this very topic back in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and that book was written by a scholar named Muhaddith Nuri. Muhaddith Nuri, as I also mentioned in the Dictations about preliminaries of reflection, if you recall, I had said that Shaheed Qadi Tabatabai was known for his book named, a book that he wrote about Arba'in, proving that Arba'in, the caravan of Imam Hussein salam, actually came to Karbala, and that it was a refutation of a scholar named Muhaddith Nuri. Now, Muhaddith Nuri had written a book called Lulu and Marjaan. It's a Farsi book. It's written in Persian. And in that book, there's two parts to it. In the first part of the book, he talks about the idea of sincerity for speakers. And that first section is literally him calling out people who charge money. And then the second part of that book is about lying. And it is in that second part where he discusses fabrications that are happening on the pulpit. And over there, he makes his arguments against, the caravan coming to Karbala on the day of Arba'in. So Shaheed Qadi Tabatabai is addressing the second part of that book, or at least some of the arguments in the second part of that book. But the main point here is that I had figured out that there was actually a book written about this topic, and hence it makes you realize that this is not a new issue, that this was an issue that some of the scholars had seen and experienced and had even already condemned literally a century ago. And that becomes extremely important when you want to study the overall Shi'i, changes in the Shia community, how ideas and mindsets change. You want to learn and see the experience of the past, particularly, which is not it's not ancient history. 100 years is very recent. And you want to see what exactly is happening. When did this whole phenomenon start? Why did people start charging money? What were the reasons for it? Did anyone call it out? How are they justifying it? And how this sort of becomes mainstream eventually. And to be honest, if it is actually a valid and justified practice, then then we should not call it out. So on both sides of the argument, we need to look at both sides of the argument. So when I went to Qom, I obviously picked up Farsi. And one of the things that I will recommend any seminarian who goes to, let's say, Qom or Najaf, anywhere, if you want to improve your language, ability to understand language, whether it's Persian and especially if it's Arabic and these two key languages, try to translate as much as you can. And that's something that became a habit. I made it into a habit. Hence why if you go on the website, iqraonline.net, the main website, you're going to see tons of articles, because a lot of them were actually just me trying to practice my translation work. And I would not move from a passage or a line until I could, figure out what it's saying. In the beginning, it's a little bit difficult because you don't know a lot of the vocabulary, or you don't know a lot of the proverbs that are being used, or the sentence structures that are being used. But eventually, you're going to become really, really good at it. And you will notice in a couple of years that you have now developed a skill of translation. You've developed a skill of writing, editing, researching, all this stuff, slowly, naturally, you're going to start building it. Because within the seminary itself, no one's going to teach you this. It's not like there's courses on research methodologies or writing skills and so on. Perhaps, you can find some private class that is happening, but that's not how it works, generally speaking. This is something that you're going to have to work on yourself. So I found this book in one of the bookstores, over there, Lulu wa Marjaan. I think I was just like walking by and I saw it. So I was like, oh, this is the book, Lulu wa Marjaan. This is the one I had heard about. So I picked it up, and this was, I believe now, 2013 or 2014. It was 2014 most probably. And I said, I'm going to try and translate the first section of this book. Now, I had only been in Iran for about a year or so by then. Or, a year or so. So Farsi is pretty decent, we're communicating. But translation is not that easy. And particularly, you're going to translate a text from 100 years ago. So the Farsi is going to be a little bit different, of course. But I said, I'm going to give it a try. And I'm going to put in my effort to translate it, because at least my ability to understand Persian text is going to get better, especially if it's a text from 100 years ago. And not to mention, it's a research as well, because you're really going to go into the world of Muhaddith Nuri and what was happening in Iraq. He was in Najaf, so what was happening in the Iraq, in Najaf, in the Iraqi world, with the Rozikhans and the Marsiyas and the Nohas and the Latmiyas, what was happening in Iran. So you go into this world and you really start to develop a sense of this. You start learning intellectual history of the Shi'i community. That was, one of the main advantages of doing this. So Muhaddith Nuri wrote this book. Okay, he wrote this book, Lulu wa Marjaan. And as I said, Muhaddith Nuri, about Muhaddith Nuri himself a little bit. He died in 1902, and he's buried in Najaf. He's a very interesting scholar. He's a muhaddith, they call him a muhaddith, so he's a very strong scholar of hadith, and he has numerous works, but he had very serious akhbari tendencies. He had very serious akhbari tendencies, meaning he was very, very lenient. To quite an extent, he was lenient in accepting reports, and he has written some works that are very, very problematic as well. He wrote a book on the tahrif of Quran, proving that the Quran is altered. Is one of the main books that he has written, because there are reports in the Shi'i works that when you read them, it's going to look like that there is alteration in the Quran, or ayat of the Quran are missing. And most of our scholars throughout history have interpreted them or rejected them, or they said that, the ghulat, people who are liars and exaggerators, they are the ones who narrated these, so we don't accept them. Or they gave some sort of interpretation that, look, this is not talking about ayat missing, or the ayat are being, read in a different way. Rather, these are the narrations where the imams are just adding commentary to those ayat, and it looks like the imam is reading a different ayah, but that's not the case. Anyways, they came with different interpretations, but Muhaddith Nuri, because he had this akhbari way of thinking, he took those reports on face value, and he wrote an entire book on proving the alteration of the Quran. And so anyways, it's been refuted and so on. It's a very, if you want to look at it critically, you can critique it very, very easily, because, as I said, Muhaddith Nuri had this, had a bit of leniency. Anyways, him coming and writing this book is also interesting, because you would expect that a scholar that is lenient, doesn't really care about accepting narrations, that he would be fine with, with people just narrating whatever on the pulpit. But you notice that he isn't. He's a little bit sensitive, because in his day and age, he's saying that things have gone so beyond, basically being normal, that people are now just creating things. Because Muhaddith Nuri is saying, look, if something exists in the books and the reports, and these books are not known to be lies and fabrications, then yeah, sure, you can narrate it. And he narrates many things which even today, for us, it will sound very absurd. But just because it exists in a hadith book, he was fine with it. His problem was that he was saying that there are people narrating things which are just not even any books. They're literally just made up. Inshallah, when we, at some time, maybe in the Dictations, we're going to talk about the history of the maqatil literature, the maqtal of Imam Hussein, how was it developed, how was it created, when all these problems start coming in, we're going to maybe address this a little bit. But in today's talk, we just want to look at the first half of the book, which is, as I said, it starts off with sincerity. He says that the speakers, so his target are actually the Rozikhan. Rozikhan are people who recite the Marsiya, the Musiba, the Masaib. And today in Iran, it is still very common. You get a separate person who comes and recites the Musiba. So there's a speech component, the lecture, and then there's somebody else that comes, recites the Musiba. That person is called the Rozikhan. Why they are called Rozikhan and so on, we're going to talk about it when we discuss maqatil literature at some point, inshallah. So in his first discussion, the first chapter of the book, which is actually called Ikhlas, He says, I will talk about Ikhlas, sincerity. Now, immediately you're going to be like, okay, what's the contradiction between charging money and sincerity? What's the problem? Can I not do an act out of sincerity but still charge money for it because I'm putting in the effort in it, I'm putting in my time? What's the contradiction here? And that is where Muhaddith Nuri's arguments are going to start, it's going to seem a little bit unique in that sense. And we're going to sort of look at it. This is a summary. Maybe I'll offer some observations every now and then, but most of what I'm about to do is a summary of his arguments. What is he trying to say? Muhaddith Nuri has to establish a very fundamental premise. If you disagree with this premise, then everything else in that book becomes useless for you. Okay? So this preliminary, this premise is very important for Muhaddith Nuri. And this is something he does also in his book where he's talking about the alteration of the Quran. He starts with a very specific preliminary where he says that there are many narrations that say that the Islam and the Muslims will go through the same type of issues and problems like the Jewish and the Christian tradition went through. And then he uses that as a preliminary to then say, well, the Jewish and the Christian tradition also, their books were altered, and therefore, our book is also altered, and he starts quoting narrations. Anyways, that's a different topic, but over here he does a very similar tactic as well. He says, look, Roze Khani, reciting Nohas and Marsiyas and Masaib, where you are coming and reciting poetry, and in this poetry you're also educating people, telling them about Islam and teaching them about the message of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He says this is basically, you are making someone cry. That's what Roze Khani is for. The purpose of Roze Khani is to make someone cry. He says this is an act of worship. Okay? He says this is an act of ibadah. And how is he proving that? He's saying, well, we have dozens and dozens and hundreds of narrations about the recommendation and about the reward of making someone cry for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This is, and when the Imams are telling you this as a responsibility, well, that is now that's an act of ibadah. It's an act of worship. This is something that is very, very important. And he says, look, both making someone cry is an ibadah, and also crying itself is an ibadah. So when you are in a majlis and you are crying and mourning on Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he says that's also an ibadah, because the Imams have said, to cry on Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And then they have also said that you must, it's good to make other people cry for Imam Hussein. That's also something that is rewarded. So he says, look, both of these are acts of worship, making someone cry and then crying itself. But he says, okay, but there's a difference. The difference is that crying is possible for everyone. Anyone can cry, and everyone can cry. Like if their heart is soft and they are focusing on the musibah of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, even the harshest of and the darkest of hearts can cry. He says anyone can cry. This is not something that is outside of the strength of humans. All humans can cry. Men can cry, women can cry, everyone can cry. But making other people cry is not something that can be done by everyone. It is something that only a particular segment in each society, in every era, only they can do this, because that requires a certain level of skill. It requires a certain skill set. Okay, and that skill set may mean you better be good at poetry, your voice better be good, your presentation needs to be good, and so on. It's a skill. Not anyone can just come on the minbar and make someone cry. In many times in our communities, I've heard that some communities don't invite a certain speaker because, well, this speaker can't make people cry, or their masaib are very dry and they're not very emotional. They don't really evoke any emotions, and communities will cancel an entire speaker because of that. I've seen that myself happening. So therefore, it's clear that Muhaddith Nuri is saying, well, therefore it's very known that this is a skill. Not everyone can just do it. Okay, now, so there's two things now. He's saying it's an act of worship, and it is also an act of worship that not everyone can do. Okay, not everyone can do. So what does he say? He says, we all know that in ibadah, so now that you have proven that this is an act of worship, well, in Islam, what is a very basic condition for worship? The very basic condition for worship is that it needs to be done qurbatan ilallah. It cannot be done for any other reason. The moment you do it for showing off, for making money, for whatever other intention, that's it. Your ibadah now is invalidated. If I pray because someone's going to give me money, your ibadah is finished. The salat is batil. If you pray, but you're doing it with the intention of Riya and showing off your tajweed and your beautiful qira'ah, your salat is batil. This is very basic rules of the salat or any act of worship. So he starts out with this, and therefore he says that, look, the moment a speaker, or in his words, a Roze Khan, the moment they step on the first step of the pulpit, they must forget everyone and everything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He must not look towards winning the hearts of anyone, or seek to earn wealth when he climbs the pulpit, to recite the tragic narratives and to make the audience cry. This is how Muhaddith Nuri is starting. And he says that, look, if this person is going to be reciting for the purpose of earning wealth, or to ensure that other people in other cities and in other countries get to hear about him and hear about his talents and his excellence, and then that becomes a subject of discussion in different towns and so on, he says this speaker, this Roze Khan, has thrown himself in the pit of fire, in hellfire basically. So this is how Muhaddith Nuri is beginning. He has to establish that this is an act of worship, and as an act of worship, niyyah of qurbatan ilallah is important, and anything else, if you do it for any other reason, that's it, your act is invalidated and it's not even accepted. So you may be doing this act thinking you're getting close to God, but you're actually distancing yourself from God. He's gonna argue that as well. Obviously, we can, this point itself is a very interesting point, that this is an act of worship. Because when you look at acts of worship are also, there's a very interesting question that you could ask. That I thought that the deen was completed with Ghadir. The deen was completed. And all the acts of worship that were legislated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they were already, taught by the Prophet, and Islam had completed. Where did this act of worship come from? Was this something that was taught by the Prophet? Is this something in the Muslim hadith corpus that says that the Prophet taught us or told us to mourn upon Imam Hussein on in these specific days? Is there a command that we're getting from him somewhere? Or no, do we find this to be a later practice that, let's say, from Imam Baqir alayhi salam onwards? I mean, you cannot have this act of worship because Karbala hasn't even happened. Karbala will happen in 60 Hijri. So what is the nature of this act of worship is what I'm trying to ask. What is the nature of this? Is this a act of worship that never existed before and now it's a new legislation, it's a new Sharia law, whereas the deen was completed already? So how do you understand this? That's one question that come to mind. Obviously, someone can answer by saying, well, it could have been a law that the Prophet did teach, that the Prophet did tell at least certain people that, look, when Imam Hussein is martyred, this is something that you're going to have to do. It's possible, or it's possible he just taught the Imam Ali and then that knowledge came down. This is a possible justification that someone can give. But generally speaking, what is the nature of this ibadah? Is this ibadah, because look, if you turn it into a case that you say this is an ibadah, well, ibadat in the Islamic tradition, as the usulis will look at it, they are pure ta'abbud. They are pure submission. Meaning you can no longer rationalize them. You can no longer, for example, you can no longer say Fajr is prayed at in the morning time. Well, that this was probably because in those day and age, in those days people would wake up earlier. That's why they were waking up at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. But now, we start work at 9 a.m. and people usually wake up around 7, 8. So we can pray Fajr around 7, 8. You cannot do that in the acts of worship. because the assumption, the underlying assumption in acts of worship is that you have no clue why God has legislated these acts in these specific ways. You cannot change anything about it. If God asked us to jump up and down and pray, well, we would have had to jump up and down. But He has asked us to pray in this specific form, so you have to pray in that specific form. Basically, in ibadat, the form becomes extremely important, the apparent form of it. You cannot alter that apparent form. Unlike acts of non-worship. For example, in business transactions, marriage customs, mostly, business transactions, you can change the form of things. If the Prophet was doing the business transaction in the Arabic language, well, it's not required for you to do it in Arabic language, right? The main crux of a business transaction is that a transaction has taken place and both parties are satisfied. As long as that essence is maintained, you are fine. You can do the business transaction in English or in Urdu or any other language. But when it comes to ibadat, you cannot change it. You cannot say, I'm going to pray in Farsi or English or Urdu. You're going to have to pray in Arabic. Why? Because it's ta'abbud. God has given us this form. You do it. So why am I mentioning this? Because if you say this is an act of worship, in that sense, well, then you're going to have to be very precise in what you can do. Can we, if the Imams have told us to commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in a very specific form that exists in the tradition, well, then you cannot go beyond that. You cannot add things to it. You cannot make it into what it is today and say, well, this is just a cultural expression. How can you say it's a cultural expression when you're saying it's an act of worship? An act of worship, only Allah can tell us how to do that act of worship. You can no longer make this into a cultural expression. So you see, this can open up that discussion. So anyways, these are just my observations. If you say it's an act of worship and that's what you mean by it, act of worship that, this is something that was legislated and the form of it has to be the way that the Imams have taught us. Well, the Imams taught us a very different way of mourning the ceremonies. Very simple, right? Most of it was focused on poetry and just gathering in a house, commemorating and remembering him. Mostly it was poetry, basically. Poetry and crying. There was nothing else at that time. So this is something that you would have to answer for. And Muhaddith Nuri doesn't address this. What does he do instead? He says, because this is an act of worship, we're going to start looking at the other aspects of Islam which show us what type of conditions and rules are applicable on the act of worship, and we're going to try and apply those also in the act of making other people cry and Roze Khani and so on. So he goes through a couple of consequences. He says, if you do Roze Khani and if you try to commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussein in this way, and you are trying to charge money for it and so on, there's going to be a problem. And that problem, he says, I'll quote, he says, look, the first consequence that's going to happen, first result, there's around 3-4 consequences that he mentions. 4 of them he mentions. He says the first consequence that will happen if you do not have sincerity, and he's linking sincerity to charging money. This is the whole discussion. He says that this is going to result in Riya in worship. You are now not doing this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are doing it to make sure that your fame and your skill set are known. Your knowledge is known, and you are now becoming a instance of somebody who does Riya. And he quotes many narrations. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to quote one of the traditions that he cites over here. As I said, he has many traditions. And the book is translated. As I said, I translated it already. It is on Iqra Online. I'll link it. Now, it is a very old translation of mine from 2015, I believe. So it's not my best translation. It was my first ever work, but you can definitely check it out. The link will be in the description. He quotes a narration from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and he says that, look, he who acquires knowledge of the traditions to earn worldly gains will have no share of rewards in the akhirah. And he who acquires this knowledge for the betterment of his hereafter will be sanctioned by Allah the good of this life and the hereafter. So what is Muhaddith Nuri trying to say by quoting this? He's saying, look, if you are showing off, if you are learning all of these skills, because he's saying, look, many people are trying to learn this skill of Roze Khani and reciting the Musibah because they want to earn a livelihood from it, and they want to become famous and they want to become known. then he quotes this narration that, look, if you are going to be if you're going to try and learn this skill because of these reasons, you're basically a show off. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, you will not have the reward of anything. You will not have any share of a reward in the hereafter. But if you are trying to gain this knowledge and this skill set because you want to better your akhirah, then yes, Allah will give you the good of this life and the akhirah. So that's how Muhaddith Nuri is beginning. He says, look, the first consequence is that you are going to become a misdaq, an instance of someone who does Riya, someone who does show off. And of course, we know at the moment you do Riya in an act of worship, the act of worship is invalidated. It's done. It has no value at that point. That's how he begins. Then he says, look, it's not the only consequence. There's a second consequence of Riya. And this one is the one that is important. And he goes through many, as I said, many narrations. But I'm not going to go through all of them. There's a lot and that he goes through them. But he says, basically, what is the consequence? He says, look, the consequence is that essentially, there's another interesting point that I wanted to mention here. Yeah. He says, look, the consequence, a second consequence is that you become a misdaq, an instance, an example of those people who take the al-Bayt as a financial source of their income and livelihood. This is the scary one. He says, Muhaddith Nuri says, we have tons of narrations where the Imams alayhimus salam are saying to people, to companions, do not take our name, do not make our name and our message and use it for your own income and for your own livelihood. And this is something that a number of a few followers of the Imams, and for every Imam, they were definitely doing this. Some of the people and some of the companions of the Imams who were not trustworthy people, of course, they were definitely using the Imam and his message and his sort of, if they were close to the Imam, they would try to use that close association for their own benefit, for their own livelihood, for their own, making their own cults, making their own, groups and parties and so on. For example, the ghulat are known for this. People who would exaggerate a lot of the things, they were known for this because people are interested in these mysterious dimensions and esoteric dimensions. So some of the ghulat who were exaggerators and liars, they would make up stories about the Imams and then they would sell them to people and they would collect money, they would make their own fame, they would make their own name. And they caused a lot of destruction to the Shi'i communities in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. This is well known, unfortunately. So Sheikh Muhaddith Nuri is saying that if you are in this practice of charging money, and that's what the whole purpose is, well, you are now becoming an instance and a misdaq of someone who uses the name of the Ahlul Bayt as a source of your income and your livelihood. And he quotes, as I said, he quotes a couple of traditions, but I'm going to just quote one of them from the one he quotes from the Amali of Sheikh Mufid. So if you recall, when we talked about the Amali literature, we mentioned Sheikh Mufid also had an Amali. He quotes a tradition from the Amali of Sheikh Mufid. This is a lengthier tradition, but I'm just quoting the one line that is relevant for us. He says, Sheikh Mufid is recording this narration from the Imam. He says, O Abu Nu'man, do not devour and do not eat people's wealth by using our name. Right? Ya Aba Nu'man, لا تستأكل بنا الناس فلا يزيدك الله بذلك إلا فقرا. Do not eat the wealth of the people using our name and using our message, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not increase you in anything except more faqr, more poverty. You will become poor in this dunya and the akhirah. Okay, that's what it means. It doesn't just mean, like someone might say, well, no, if I'm using their name to make money, well, I'm increasing in my wealth. This type of faqr doesn't just mean financial. It means you you are poor in your spirituality, you are poor in your proximity to God, you're going to be poor in the akhirah. That's the main thing. So he quotes this narration, and then, as I said, he quotes a lot of other narrations. There's another narration that he quotes, لا تأكلوا الناس بآل محمد. Do not eat people's wealth by the name of Al Muhammad. As I said, he quotes a number of traditions, but what these traditions are doing for us is that they are creating a culture for us. Meaning, in the Shia culture, the Imams are telling you the type of culture that should be maintained. This is what's the important point Muhaddith Nuri is trying to make. He's saying, look, the culture that the Imams are trying to make is not one that is prevalent right now. They are saying, do not use their name as a source of livelihood. If people in society, in the communities, think that yes, you are someone who uses this entire message as a source of your livelihood, well then you're obviously an instance of what the Imams are condemning. What else does this mean? Then what is the example of this? If this is not, Muhaddith Nuri is saying, if what you're doing is not an example of this, if you charging money and setting rates and then making this your whole livelihood, if that is not an instance, an example of this narration, then what is the example of this narration? Who is the Imam talking about? Who are these people who use the name of the Imam to earn their livelihood? Who are these people then? This is what Muhaddith Nuri is saying. Now, funny thing is, he says, this is the important part, and I will quote from my own translation because it's just quicker. He says, look, this second consequence that we're talking about, that people are seeking, making their own livelihood from the names of the al-Bayt, he says, look, the flames of this second category of individuals, meaning these people who are using the money, using the name of the Imams for their livelihood, has taken over many knowledgeable people. Meaning even knowledgeable people who know about these things, they have fallen for this. The most clear example of this is that group of speakers and reciters. Okay, and he means specifically he uses the word rozekhan here. That whose real purpose of learning the skill and that which relates to it, such as learning the narrations. So these people, obviously, rozekhan has to learn the hadith, they have to learn the narrations because they want to usually include them in their masaib. Learning how to lecture and give sermons and khutbahs, and in fact even learning religious terms for matters where their usage is necessary. So sometimes you will see rozekhans, they will use certain Islamic jargon and terms because they need to know some of these terms, is solely for the sake of business and attaining wealth. He says many knowledgeable people have been fallen for this. This is done without any hesitation, without any dissimulation or concealment. He's saying, oh, people are openly doing this. Instead, they do transactions just like businessmen. They discuss the prices being too high or too low. And in order to get permission to recite at a gathering, they write letters citing their availability and send a middleman who can find them a place to recite. Basically, they have their own secretaries who will go and try to propagate them and market them. If they receive an amount which is less than what they had expected after reciting at the gathering, they get angry and they speak badly about the organizer of the gathering. They shame the organizer. In fact, some ill-natured reciters even start questioning these organizers and people who organize the majalis. They start questioning them from the top of the pulpits. And this is something that has happened in even recent times. That's how the whole 2007, between 2007 and 2012, that whole fitna that was existing in the community, that's actually how it started. There were these clips flying around of certain speakers saying, you should charge, and people who don't charge, communities, people who don't charge are a problem, and so on. So, in fact, some ill-natured reciters start questioning them from the top of the pulpits, looking for a sponsor and to make deals over what they have recited. And then he goes on. This is the funny part. He says, وَأَزْ أَجَائِبِ خَنْدَدَار آن که با این کاسبی و تجارت و معاوضه دنیا به آخرت. And it's a long paragraph. One of the issues with Persian books is that they barely have any paragraphs. It's just a long chunk of sentences. This is something that is anyone who has read Farsi books, especially older books, and has tried to translate them, you will notice they are all run-on sentences. So this is one of those run-on sentences, but in my translation I've tried to break it up. But he says that one of the absurd and laughable things one of the absurd and laughable things is that despite these business-like transactions and exchanging of the akhirah for this dunya, this person sits on top of the minbar in the gatherings, feels proud, and considers himself a special servant of Imam Hussein. He considers himself deserving greater rights than others, and considers himself more worthy of deserving respect, generosity, and glorification. And then he says that this poor and blind person is totally heedless of the fact that there is no relationship between him and Imam Hussein. The distance between him and the Imam is greater than the distance between the earth and the sky. His status is even lower than the lowest rank of workers in society. His name is registered in the books of businessmen, and so on and so forth. He says, this person has to pay khums on the money that he's making and so on. Anyways, so this is something that he mentioned. You can tell, Muhaddith Nuri is just fed up. He's just fed up. And then he says, look, these guys, these reciters, their work is just like the students of the Hawza, people who are pursuing religious studies. If their studies are considered to be an act of worship, and they are told to not make their learning a means of making business and making money, which is a very common understanding for the seminary students. You're not going to the seminary to make money. That's not the whole point. Your main intention is proximity to Allah and learning the truth. That's what it is. But if he's saying if that is the case over there, well, there's no difference between a Hawza student and you, because you are also learning the knowledge of the al-Bayt, and then you're going to go and present it to the people. So this is something that he is mentioning. Now, this is a second consequence. In the middle, in the section right after that, he tries to say that, look, there are some people who have tried to argue that there are some legitimate ways to earn money by doing Roze Khani and reciting the Musayib and so on. He says, look, some people have tried to say that you can justify this act through this notion of niyabat, meaning just like, let's say somebody wasn't able to do Hajj, or they missed a tawaf, maybe a obligatory tawaf that they had to do. What do? You appoint a naib, you appoint a representative who will go and do the tawaf or the entire Hajj even on behalf of you. This is something that is allowed. That naib is going to charge money for it. He's not going to do the Hajj for free. So he says, look, some people have tried to argue through this lens and say, look, when we recite the Roze Khani, we are not doing it for our own selves. We are doing it as we are trying to represent the organizer of the majlis, and that's why we're charging money. He says, look, these arguments are there, but at the end he says, be careful of these type of loopholes that you're trying to make. And then he says, listen to your marja. Is this from those acts of worship where niyabat is even relevant, or is it not relevant? Anyways, as I don't want to go into the technicalities of that, he himself doesn't give a clear-cut answer. He says, look, follow your marja on this. So he says, now, what does he do right after that? Which is very interesting. In that same section, he does this. So this is before he even goes to the third consequence. He's talking about ways to earn money. What does he do? He says, look, the act of making someone cry. So when you are doing Roze Khani, if you are a Roze Khan or you're a reciter, your job, your amal is very similar to the task and the responsibility of the mu'adhin, the person who gives the adhan. He says, look, and this is, so he makes an argument. He quotes a narration first, where I'll just quote the narration here, from Imam Ali alayhi salam. He says, look, this is from Sheikh Saduq in his Al-Faqih. A man came near Amir al-Mu'mineen and said, O Amir al-Mu'mineen, by Allah, I love you. The Imam replies to him, but I detest you. I don't like you. So the man said, why? And the Imam replied, because you seek to make profit through the adhan. So this was also a thing. And there are many narrations about this, that there were people who were responsible for giving the adhan in the masjid, but they would try to charge money for it. And Muhaddith Nuri is trying to say, look, there are so many similarities between the act of adhan is also an act of worship. but it's a mustahab act of worship. He says the Roze Khani is also an act of worship, and it is also a recommended act of worship. It's not like from the wajibat, like the 5 daily prayers. And he says, look, in the adhan, what is the job of the muaddin? The job of the muaddin is to inform the people and the believers about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remind them about Allah, reminding them to come in the presence of their Lord, come to the masjid. And the other responsibility of the muazzin is to invite people towards good deeds, to salvation, towards thawab, reward, all of these things. They are inviting people. And he says the Roze Khan is also doing a very similar task, similar thing. He's inviting people to salvation, because crying for Imam Hussein alayhi salam is gonna, forgive your sins. It will open the doors for salvation. And the Roze Khan is also announcing the arrival of Muharram. They are announcing the mourning season, and so on. So he's saying, look, these are very, very similar acts. And if charging money is condemned, and Imam Ali does not even like the person who gives the adhan charging money, then he says, because of these similarities, Roze Khani should also have the similar etiquettes and similar laws on it. Someone can say, this is Muhaddithun, this is a type of qiyas. Like, what are you doing over here? Adhan is something else, Roze Khani is something else. Like, if these are acts of worship, you cannot even make these type of similarities, because what is qiyas? You're just looking at some similarities in X, and then you are saying, well, Y also has these similarities, so the X will also get applied on Y. And when it comes to acts of worship, that becomes 10 times more difficult to do, because you really don't know why Allah is making, something haram in X, and why Allah may make something halal in Y. In acts of worship, it becomes very difficult. But once again, Muhaddith Nuri, maybe he could argue by, citing things. There are some legal, principles that you can use to say, well, no, the criteria here, the reason why Allah is making or the Imam is condemning people for charging money for giving adhan is for the fact that this is an invitation to Allah. And that is the criteria. So if that criteria exists in Roze Khani or anywhere else, and you charge money for it, well, that's going to be condemned as well. These type of legal principles exist, but it's going to, you have to subject it to a research and investigation. Muhaddith Nuri obviously is writing this book for the Roze Khans. He's not writing it for scholars. So he's not going into that level of technicality. It's not a technical book at all, actually. It's not very technical. It's just a very straightforward book. So that's the second consequence he mentions. He then goes and mentions a third consequence. And he says the third consequence is that you become a mislaq, an instance of those people who have sold their akhirah for the dunya. He says you have sold your akhirah for the dunya. Once you have made this act of worship a source of your livelihood and your fame and your money and all this stuff, that's it. You've sold your akhirah for dunya, because this is all dunyawi things. Fame and money and popularity and how much people are talking about you and what rates you're setting. These are all dunyawi things. And you are using an act of worship to get all of this. You have sold your akhirah. And he starts quoting many, many narrations over here as well. And he says, look, we in our Islamic tradition, firstly, he says that, look, so some of the narrations he quotes are about people who charge money for teaching the basic necessity of the Quran, teaching the basic Quran to someone, or teaching any wajibat, meaning you charge money for teaching someone how to pray salat. He says all of these are condemned, and according to the jurists, actually the money is haram for this. So he says, look, Roze Khani also is very similar. It's an act of worship, and when you charge money, instead of getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're distancing yourself from it. Anyways, in this line of argument, he starts a very interesting story here, where he says that the Imams, they were so careful about this entire phenomenon of selling your akhirah for the dunya. He says that, look, the Imams would try to make sure that they don't even pay less than the value of a certain item. Because for them, that was also you selling your akhirah for the dunya. Meaning, if something is worth, let's say $50, and if the seller looks at you and your status, and you are the Khalifa of the Muslim, kingdom, or you are someone very special or a very special scholar, and the person, and you use that as your as your point to get a discount. He says this is also condemned, and the Imams would believe even this is an instance of you selling your akhirah for the dunya, you using these qualities of yours to buy something below what the actual value of that item is. This is not talking about bargaining and getting something for a lower price, because usually those sellers have already put the price for a higher price. So in those transactions, the seller is not losing money. They still make money, maybe it's a little bit less, but they're still selling it for the value that it is worth. They're not going to sell it below value and then incur a loss. But sometimes what happens is, because a seller might look at you and say, oh wow, this is a very famous scholar or a very famous Roze Khan, a very famous individual, then they are going to feel obliged that maybe I have to sell this item to you for even below the value of that item. And you as an individual are going to take advantage of that. He says the Imams were against this. And he quotes stories from Imam Ali alayhi salam's life himself. And he quotes two versions of one of the story, one story, but it's quoted in two different ways. He says that the Imam went to a store and the man said to him, "Oh, Amir al-Mu'mineen." He went to basically buy some clothes, some cloth. And the man said, "Oh, Amir al-Mu'mineen." As soon as the Imam heard that, he walked out of that store. And he went to another store where the man said, "Ya Sheikh." And then the Imam bought the clothes from there. And what's the point of this story? Meaning, the Imam realized that in the first store, the guy recognized the Imam. And because he recognized him, Imam knew that this guy is going to try to give him a discount. Maybe he might feel obliged, okay, I have to sell this cloth for a cheaper price. But as soon as he went to the other store where the man said, "Ya Sheikh," oh old man, he didn't recognize the Imam, and he would have treated him like a normal person, and he would have charged him whatever rate he was charging. In a second version of that story, the person who said "Ya Sheikh" and then he sold the Imam the cloth, the owner of the shop realized later on that the employee sold a certain clothing item to Imam Ali for a certain price, and the owner came to the Imam and he said, "I apologize, we should have given you a discount." And the Imam tells him, "No, what you have given, the transaction has already happened. Both parties were satisfied, and that's it. Imam says, I don't do that. I don't go around telling people, oh, I'm the Imam or I'm the Khalifa of the Muslim world, give me a discount." Says, I don't do that, and this is condemned. I don't want to sell my akhirah for the dunya, for these, petty $2. And over there, Muhaddith Nuri quotes a Shaheed al-Thani. A Shaheed al-Thani is one of the greatest jurists of the Shi'i world, Imami Shi'i scholar. He has a book where he writes a commentary on another book of fiqh, which is the one we study in the Hawza, Lum'a, Sharh of Lum'a, the commentary on Lum'a. Lum'a is written by Shaheed Awwal, and the commentary on it is by Shaheed Thani. Shaheed Thani discusses the etiquettes of buying and selling and transactions and so on. And over there he says that, look, if there is a difference in the customers, meaning a certain customer has a certain merit, or a certain customer is at a certain level of religiosity or has a certain status, Shaheed Thani says, look, it's not haram to give a discount on the price. It's not haram. But he says, however, it is still very, very makruh for the customer to accept this. So the seller might give you the discount because he says, okay, this is a very religious person, this is a very famous reciter, this is a very famous scholar. So seller might, out of his goodwill, might want to do that. But it is makruh for the customer to accept that difference. Meaning the seller is noticing a difference. This customer of mine is a normal person, this customer of mine is a scholar, he has knowledge. It is now makruh for the buyer to acknowledge that difference, that yes, I am a scholar, you better give me a discount. And Shaheed Thani says, the Salaf, our predecessors, the scholars and the religious ulama, were such people that they appointed others as their representatives, and these representatives would not be recognized by the sellers. and then these reps would go and purchase on the behalf of the scholars. So in order to avoid that whole scenario. So because when you have a normal person, a representative that is going, the seller is not going to know who this person, they're going to treat them all equally. So Shaheed Thani is saying, look, to this extent, ulama, the righteous, pious scholars, and of course the imams in the narrations that he's quoting, will go to that extent to make sure that they don't become an instance of selling the dunya for selling their akhirah for the dunya. He says that, unfortunately, what we're seeing in our culture, this is, as I said, this is 100+ years ago. He's talking about it 100 years ago. Now, with all the modern social media and whatnot, you can analyze the situation yourself at where we are today. What is the culture that the Ahlul Bayt are trying to create, and what culture we are promoting and pushing and justifying, and everything seems okay. We don't look at these things critically, unfortunately. We don't even look at what is in our own books and tradition. This is the tragedy that we are in. Shaheed and Muhaddith Nuri is saying that some of these Roze Khans and these speakers, they do the exact same thing. They go to certain places and they ask for certain rates, and they set certain rates, or they ask for certain privileges. They ask for certain perks, and they burden the host and the organizer, and they burden them by making them feel like, yes, I am a special scholar, I have a certain type of knowledge, I have a certain type of a voice, I'm this famous, I have this many, I can bring you this much of a crowd, so I also now deserve these perks and whatnot. The Islamic etiquette is telling us something else. Unfortunately, what is sometimes prevalent, of course, we're not blaming anyone over here in person or anyone. I don't even know. I'm not really in that world, but obviously things we hear, things, and we sometimes observe certain things in our communities. So this is what he says. And then he starts complaining about his own time. Muhaddith Nuri, he goes on a rant. He says, look, when the market is good, these people, these speakers and these reciters, Roze Khans, they're always excited because they have so many customers, there's so much demand, so they're ready to supply it, and they're always in demand. He's talking about how these people have turned this entire phenomenon of reciting and musibah into just a business thing. It's a business venture. He says these people, when the market is good, let's say it's Muharram season, these guys are happy, they're excited, they have so many customers. But the moment the market is down, they become dull, they start complaining, and they get jealous if their competitors are better than them. He says, when desperate to attract customers, they trap themselves on the path of competition, each of them being a separate cause of destruction of his religion and his life. For example, they will resort to suffering humiliation. They will humiliate themselves by using flattery to ask the customer's friends, or even the customer's servants about using their services. So they will go and ask the host or some individual, oh, do you want to invite me? Or they will try to use their network to get an invitation somewhere. They will try to seek information about the contracts of their own colleagues and then announce their personal hidden defects and faults. So if a certain mosque or a certain Husseiniya invites a certain competitor of theirs, they will tell the people, oh, that speaker, that reciter, he's not good, or he was like this, and his voice is not good, or he cheats people. They'll just start mentioning their hidden faults. And if any of the other reciters succeed, if the other competitors, so look, Shaheed and Muhaddith Nuri is turning this into a whole business. It's like these are just business ventures and these are just competitions. If other reciters succeed this individual, they will develop enmity and jealousy towards them in their hearts. If they defeat the other competitor, they will feel proud and take glory in their actions. And if they cause others to leave the field altogether, they feel as if they have just received the medal of victory. Okay? This is, and as I said, you can read the entire translation of this. He goes on and on and on. Finally, he mentions a fourth consequence, and that is, I'm not going to go into detail on that, but he basically says that, one of the consequences of this is that you become an instance of those people who do not practice what you preach. And inshallah, maybe we will talk about this entire problem in some other dictation. Practicing what you preach. What exactly is this? Do you even have the right to preach if you're not practicing? So on. But he says that's one of the examples as well. But I don't want to end it here. There is one final thing that Muhaddith Nuri does. Because maybe some of you are thinking, what the heck, like, if a person's gonna spend that much time and so much time on this skill, and then they're not gonna gain any money from it, how are they gonna live their life? How can they even do this responsibility of making other people cry if they don't have money coming out of it? Muhaddith Nuri says, look, I'm gonna give you a better and a more ethical way to do this. And he ends, so by the way, there's 2 other chapters in the middle which I'm skipping. I'm just going to the last section. He says, look, there is a responsibility on the organizers. Okay? He says on page 83, وظیفه صاحب مجلس و عزاداران نسبت به روزه خوانان. Says the responsibility of the organizers of the majalis and the azadars, people who are mourning, in relation to the Roze Khans, those who are coming to recite the majalis and recite the musibah, and those who are basically making you cry on the tragedy of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. What is your responsibility over here? And it is in this section where he says, look, whether they are the organizers of the gathering or just attending as listeners, their responsibility is to help the reciter recognize their position. Their responsibility is to help the reciter. They should recognize the reciter's position. They should honor and favor, give, and put their favors on this reciter. They should honor them. They should assist and gift him with their wealth, with their praise, and through any other means possible for them. So Muhaddith Nuri is saying, look, the responsibility is on the community, on the organizers and the people who are mourning. It is morally necessary for them. It is their moral responsibility to do all of this. Whatever they do, they will never be able to fulfill the right of what this reciter has done for them. No matter how much from the luxuries of the world they give to this person, it will not equal even 1 strand of a heavenly dress that they have attained from the service. Right? So basically he's saying that by him making you cry, the thawab that you have given, the reward that you got for crying on the tragedy of Imam Hussein was a heavenly dress. He is saying if you give this reciter all of the worldly luxuries, it's not even worth 1 strand of that heavenly dress that reciter has given to you because of the fact that he made you cry. That's how Muhaddith Nuri is saying. So trying to make you understand the value of these people, the value of what these reciters are doing. And that is a far better and much more ethical way to deal with this. And then he quotes a lot of narrations from the Imams, Imam Kazim alayhi salam, I believe Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He quotes from many different narrations where the Imams themselves are giving money to reciters of poetry, those or who did any sort of teaching. So there are narrations where a poet comes, for example, Farazdak is one of the famous ones. He has recited a line of poetry in defense of the Imams, and he is sent to jail. And the Imam hears about it, and Imam writes him a letter, and he says, I've heard about this. And the Imam gives him 12,000 dirhams. This is recorded in Rijal al-Kashi as well, and also Qutb al-Rawandi's al-Khara'ij. These 2 works, it records this instance, that the Imam sent Farazdak 12,000 dirhams. 12,000 dirhams. And Farazdak says, "Oh Imam, take this back." So Farazdak actually returns the amount back. He says, "Look, I said those lines of poetry because I was just angry at the governor, at the Khalifa. So I just said those lines of poetry because I was trying, I was just in that emotional state." And the Imam says, "Take the money." So Imam returns the money back to him. And he says, "You must accept the amount, for surely Allah has seen your station and knows about your intentions." And because the Imam asked him and insisted, then Farazdak accepted the amount. Or you have another reciter, poet named Di'bil. Di'bil recited a very famous, ode, which is also translated on Iqra Online. I'll link it in the description. Imam Rida alayhi salam, different reports mention what Imam Rida gave to him, money and gifts and so on. One of the interesting narrations that he quotes is Imam, and maybe some of us have heard this on the pulpits, that Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it has been narrated that one of the teachers taught one of the sons of Imam Hussein Surah Al-Hamd. This man just taught one of the sons of Imam Hussein Surah Alhamdulillah, the Surah Fatiha. When the child read the surah in the presence of his father, the Imam gave 1,000 dinars to the teacher and suits of clothes and lavished this teacher. Somebody asked the Imam about this act. Why did you give so much? And the Imam replied, where is this act of mine compared to what this man has given? Meaning this man, what he has done by teaching my son Surah Al-Hamd, what I have given and done for him is absolutely nothing. So Muhaddith Nuri essentially is trying to balance it out. He said, look, as far as the speakers and the reciters are concerned, they should definitely not be doing it because this is an act of worship. And in an act of worship, you need to be careful. If you completely disagree with Muhaddith Nuri on the first premise and say, no, this is not even an act of worship, this is just a cultural thing. From day one, it was just a cultural thing and the Imams were just telling us how to mourn in a cultural way and nothing to do with religion and nothing to do with the act of worship. Well, then you've just critiqued his entire premise and that's it. You have a counter argument basically. But it seems most of the Shi'i community will not accept that. They will say, yes, this is an act of worship. This is an ibadah. There's a reward, thawab for it. All the stuff that is mentioned in the narrations. So Muhaddith Nuri is saying, don't charge money, don't set rates, and don't show off, don't turn it into a means of your livelihood. But on the other hand, he is asking the communities and those who are organizing the majalis to truly understand the value of these reciters. And then he, as I said, he's quoting narrations from the Imams to show how much they are actually paying to reciters and poets and those who are teaching them and so on. So this is the khulasa of the first section of the book, which is about sincerity. The second section is about lying and truth. So basically not lying on the pulpits. Meaning, before you speak on the mimbar, do your research. Make sure what you are saying is authentic and correct and, don't just tell superstitious tales and fabrications. Don't lie on the mimbar. That is his second point of the second part of the book. Inshallah, maybe some other time we can look into that. But the point of this talk was that, look, these type of discussions, they're important to understand because these are all connected to what is happening and what is prevalent in our Shia communities. If we truly want to follow and imitate the seerah of the A'imma and the culture that the Imams and the Prophet and Islam as a whole in the Quran, the culture that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to maintain, if we really want to follow that, then look at what is actually in the tradition. And then try and compare that with what is happening and see whether there is a match or no, or whether we are completely off. This requires a level of contemplation. This requires us to sit back and think about what is happening. Where are we headed? Where are we going? Okay. And anyways, this is what Muhaddith Nuri is summarizing in his, or arguing for in his book. I hope this was a window into a world of an interesting discussion, a prevalent and important one, something that is still connected with ethics and akhlaq and sincerity, but it was being applied on a very specific phenomenon that perhaps currently exists as well. And I hope that we can reflect on the teachings of the Prophet and the al-Bayt alayhimus salam along with the Quran, inshallah, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us arrive at conclusions which are in line with the teachings of the Imams alayhimus salam, inshallah. I'll see you all in a next future video. Until then, make sure you like, share and subscribe. If you have any comments, leave them inshallah at the bottom. I will see you all in a future video. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.